In this video, we're going to cover what is actually going on in our main.go file that we created in the last video. So we're going to go over everything in a good bit of detail, and generally speaking, we won't go in quite this much detail in all the future videos. We'll cover all the web request type stuff and like the web development aspects, but we won't go into the Go, how does Go work type specifics as much. In this video, I want to cover them a little bit more because it gives you a better idea of what's going on. And it's a nice just jump start into things to cover some stuff that you've probably already seen before. So the first thing we have is the first line of the program, the package. So when we have this package, what we're basically saying is that this is what we're naming this whole package. But when we call it main, we're basically saying that this is the part of the program that we want to be run whenever we start an executable. This is the first part we want to run. So main means that we're going to have a main function, and that main function is going to be the first thing that runs when we start our application up. Now there are some small caveats to that. Init functions for packages will get run first, but main is generally the first thing that's actually supposed to start running your program. Inits are used for like setup type things or minor things like that. They're not used to actually kickstart the application running. On line 3, we go to the imports. The imports are our way of pulling in packages that are either provided by the standard library, by third party, parties, or by ourselves, and they allow us to use functions and methods and types that are provided by other packages. So this allows us to reuse code across our code base. It also allows us to not have to write everything or reinvent the wheel because some of the stuff is already provided for us. In this, we're importing two packages, fumt and net HTTP. Fumt is useful for printing things out for the most part, printing data to different writers or to standard out. You probably use this whenever you were first learning Go because you would have written a hello world program, and fumt is one of the first packages you'll use. The next line is the net HTTP one, and this is the package that is generally going to be used a lot for either creating a web server, so you're handling web requests, or you can also use it to create web requests. So for example, if we wanted our program to go ping another API, we could actually use the same package to create these web requests and send them out and wait for a response. On line 8, we get to our handler function. It doesn't have to be called handler func. I call it that because it's basically just what it's generally called as a handler function. So I tend to call the first one we write handler func. This just needs to be a function that takes in two arguments, a response writer and a pointer to a request. Both types are provided by the HTTP package, and we're taking these in because we need the request so that we can look at what data the user is providing us when they make their web request. And then we need the response writer so we can send a response back to them. On the first line of this program, line 9, you can see that we are using the fumt package and we are writing to W. So W is the response writer, like I said, and it implements the io.writer interface, which is why we can use the fumt package to write to it. The second part of this is what we actually want to write out to the response writer. Now, normally we wouldn't be putting HTML in strings like this, especially if there's user-provided data, because there's all sorts of injection attacks that can sort of cause your website to be insecure. But in this case, I wanted to keep things simple, so we are just writing some HTML directly in a string and writing it back. And this is what causes us to see the welcome to my site when we visit the web application. Next up is the main function. In the main function, this is where our web application starts, and this is where we are essentially telling our HTTP package that we want to handle all web requests that come in and match this root path of /, and we want to handle them with the handler function. So this handler func is defining this. So if we rename this, say we made it hello, we would also need to rename this to be hello. So this right here is the actual function. We're passing that in, but we're not calling the function here. We're just telling it to use that function. And I said this briefly, the / part of this, the reason that handles all paths instead of just, whatever, just one specific root path, is because when you use http.handlefunc, it uses the default servmux, which probably doesn't mean anything to you right now, but it is basically a built-in router type object that will look at paths and decide which handler function should be called. And whenever it runs this, by default, if your path ends with a slash, it assumes that you want to match all paths that have that prefix. So in this case, there's no prefix, it's just the slash. But you could also make this be like dogs slash. And if I were to save this, run our application, and then go to localhost 3000, you can see that we don't get anything here, but if we slash dogs, we'll get the website. We could also type slash dog slash 123, and we'll go to the same exact handler. So this is essentially defining a prefix that we want to match, and as long as it matches this prefix, it will go ahead and use the handler function. So that is both good and bad. You'll find out later that sometimes you don't want that, sometimes you do. And this is why we will eventually start using a different router throughout our application that gives us a little bit more, customization and allows us to sort of change things up and get a little more specific. So the last line, the http.listen and serve. In this line, we're telling our application to start up the server and to listen on port 3000. So whenever you're actually defining the server and the port here, one of the things to remember is that the more specific you get, the more it will limit. Whereas if you don't provide anything specifically, it generally will take anything that sort of gets pointed to the server. So the ports are a little bit different. You need to sort of tell it the port to listen on so that it knows the correct port. I believe if you don't provide the correct port, it'll just use the defaults, but I haven't really tested that recently. But the first part, we could have put localhost 3000 and it would have still worked for localhost 3000. The reason that we're not doing that is because basically if we don't put anything there, it'll respond to any domain. So later on when we deploy our application, we could put any domain pointing to our web server, and this will still respond to it, regardless of what that domain is, as long as it gets the port correct. So it's one of those things that's nice to have, but it's not necessary. You can be more specific if you want to. The other upside to that is you could have one Go file that actually starts up multiple servers that each respond to different domains. So it's really cool that you can sort of start up many different applications all within one program. And this can be really useful down the road. For example, if you have, say you build your admin site and your regular user site, you could have one program sort of kick them both off, but each one has its own handlers and routers and stuff like that that are used for it. So the last part of this is the nil argument. We are not passing in any sort of handler for listen and serve. And the reason we do this is because we want to use the default servmux. So that's this http.handlefunc uses the default servmux. That's why we don't actually call this on a servmux object. We just call it on the this function. And by passing in nil, we're saying that we want to use that same default servmux. So later in this book, we'll actually create our own router and we'll start passing it into this thing. And it'll make a little bit more sense as to what's being used, I think. But right now we're just using the default stuff because we just want a really simple application up and running. That's about it. I know there's a lot here, and I know that it's unlikely that all this is going to completely make sense right away. For example, understanding what all we can write to the response writer to send back to the end user is something that takes some time and practice and you just getting used to. I wouldn't expect to know everything that's there right away. And similarly, you aren't going to know all the data available in a request right away. But as we start to do this, you'll see that we can explore the docs a little bit. We can find the things as we need them, and we can just slowly build up our knowledge. And that's what we're going to be doing throughout the rest of this book.